Hello and welcome to Just Draw, Just Paint Week 6. This week we'll be painting up this composition you see before you of a water tower inside a cave with some funky birds. So let's jump in and I'll show you just how I did it. Alright, let's get started with a simple brief in the top left corner. I won't obviously obey absolutely everything in that brief because we're just here to have fun. But I like to start with something in mind, and that gives me something in mind. So we have a location, which are caves. We have a weather system, there's a drought. There is some hero elements, which are flocks, although I did decide to make the hero element the actual setting, which is a water tower. And there are some, there's no design inspiration on this one. I know it says Bio Arts, but I decided to forego that because, my goodness, I would have to think very hard about composition and just how to integrate that design work. So because this is Just Draw, Just Paint, we're not here to do very complicated professional briefs. Someday I might do that in a different video series. I may or may not be working on that right now. You know, maybe. We'll see. But for these kind of videos, I don't think that's too important. You know, you guys just need to have fun. You know, just draw along with me. You know, paint something fun. Give yourself a little brief. Get stuck into drawing an environment. You know, something that's maybe a little uncomfortable for you that you're stressing about. Just get dirty, right? Just get stuck in and not worry too much about it. If it looks terrible, it looks terrible, right? And then move on. You know, do another one. So that's the whole thing about this, right? Is we have what is literally millions of options, right? I think these thumbnails kind of describe that each one of these could in some way, shape, or form become a painting, right? And it's almost like when you see 4 of them on a page like this, it's a horrible thing, but it almost reminds me of like that AI generation, you know, when you kind of click a button, you get like a bazillion options. The weird thing about that is it's kind of mimicking this process, right? This process whereby artists legit, you know, come up with a bunch of ideas before they commit to one. And the only difference is it's not polished, right? We're still in the process of refinement. We're still thinking about how do I take the stuff I like, you know, from some of these, right? And combine them with other elements that I like from others. And I really like doing that. I love this kind of sketch bashing, you know, that I haven't really seen many other people do sketch bashing. Maybe it's because it's so unrefined that people feel like they can just adjust it before they commit. But for me, and sometimes I think maybe when you're a bit more experienced as a painter, you don't necessarily have to have the world's tightest drawing. Depending, of course, on what the brief is, right? If the brief is very complicated, then it might make sense to get everything down in a very tight way so that you know what you're going to be painting is all there, right? Of course. And with natural environments, you can get away with so much looseness, right? And we're applying, by the way, the same technique here that I think we applied in week 2, where I just am painting on a layer beneath the sketch, right? So you can see the black lines on top of everything here, and I'm just laying in where I want that water tower to be in the back and making sure that I have various colors set up, like I have a pre-established palette. All of these things, they actually take away the stress of painting for me because I know that as long as I'm sticking to those parameters, then I'll be okay, right? I'm not painting everything. I'm not guessing everything. And I think this is a little bit of a misnomer with aspiring artists who think, you know, I have to have absolutely every decision left out. You know, I'll decide along the way. And I find that to be quite stressful. When you're given more options, you tend to tighten up, right? At least for me, right? I tend to tighten up and I don't really know where to take something, right? It becomes a little bit intimidating. I'm like, I could take it in one of 1 million directions. Well, which direction should I choose? I'm not sure. But if I narrow that down and I just say, you know what this is about? This is a cave situation. You know, there's going to be rocks in here. There's going to be a little bit of water. Might put some birds in. If we have the time, which I know having done this demo, I didn't find the time to do it. I could have put more vegetation in, right? I could have put a ton of like life in here. But instead, we're just trying to get down the main idea right now, right? Which is just separating our elements, creating some sense of order before we commit to anything in great detail. And you can see one of those techniques is just using a very large brush, right? And lassoing out a bunch of areas and just start working into those areas to build something. You can almost think of it as Lego, right? It's just pieces upon pieces. And often what really helps me, right, at least think of these environments is what would happen if I put one element on top of another in this place, right? So one of the things I often chat about with my students is this idea that one of the best ways to think about design and approach it is to ask questions almost out aloud if you can, right? To your artwork. You can start asking questions like, is it damp in here? How do I show that? Is it dark in this location? How do I show that? Is the water luminescent? How do I show that? Is the environment cold? How do I show it, right? So the more questions you ask, the better the kind of feel you can get into your paintings. This is what I've noticed from years and years of doing this kind of stuff, is I do that with everything I'm designing, even characters or creatures or anything like that. I try to find out what is the lowest common denominator of all my ideas, and can I convince the people looking at my work of those ideas, right? And I find that if I don't do that kind of stuff, I end up just kind of doodling around something, and what does tend to happen is stuff starts to get very generic, right? It's like, oh, if my brief says I need to have a character who is a street sweeper, for example, right? I might jump to the nearest example of that and go with that, rather than asking deeper questions, which is, where does the street sweeper sleep, right? How did he grow up or she grow up? What kind of economic situation is he in? What kind of job did he do before this? So many things can inform an idea and a design that I think it's worth spending time asking more questions. And this is really, I think, what concept artists do really well, is we try and ask as many questions about an idea before we even get stuck in, right? It's like, hold on a second, you haven't told me about this. Well, your brief says one thing. What did you mean by that? Can you go a little bit deeper? If someone says something looks funny, or someone should be funny, what do they mean by that? I'm not saying it in the sort of Joe Pesci style, what do I look like, a clown to you? But I really mean it in terms of just digging deeper, right? Being inquisitive and asking so many questions. Because after all, right, this series is about having fun and building something that is, that doesn't exist, right? We're basically little magicians here. We're creating worlds. And so a part of that is that natural curiosity that I think we all have, and that I hope all aspiring artists really work on, right? It's a kind of a skill set, actually, to just say, what am I feeling for this right now? Like, look at me, I'm just lassoing out this pathway, and my instinct is like, I want a raised, crazy zigzag pathway, right? So that's kind of what I'm working into this, right? I'm starting to develop my value structure here, right? Making sure that my things read, that the background is one value, my tower is another, and making sure that everything kind of comes together the way I hope, right? And by the way, I'm actually drawing over the water tower here, and I'm trying to paint in all the detail I have in my reference. And because this is a just draw, just paint week, I want to emphasize the idea that there are no rules here, right? If you want to drop a photo into your work, go ahead and do it, right? There's no rules in real life, as long as something is plausible and you're not straight up ripping on someone, you can do it, right? And so even with this water tower, I kind of lay it in, I put a whole bunch of effort into painting it and all that kind of stuff, and I never quite feel like it hits the original photo the same way. And so in an effort to just save time, I actually end up dropping the photo in there instead. And then I work the photo up with a little bit of paint and adjustments to make it look homogeneous with the style that I'm using here. And in that way, I'm also saving time, right? So remember, back when photo editing and all that kind of stuff came into concept art, the entire purpose of it was to just save time, right? Was to just take away the burden of working these long hours in studio rendering something when you could just apply a photo and then paint over it, right? And it's actually a skill, right? A skill to paint over something. It takes time to develop, right? So you can see just by me putting in these groove lines here and working them up, how long it takes to develop even a small element in a painting that is a focal point. Sometimes it's worth it. Like, this is a focal point, which is why I'm spending much more time on it. But it's not necessary in terms of, output. It's like, is it necessary, right? Do you have to spend that much time there? Well, the answer is not always yes. And so even with something just draw, just paint, I feel like this is such a loose and fun exercise for us to just observe and move through, that just use whatever, right? If you want a specific result, go seek that result in any means you find to be the necessary path to get you there. So going back a little bit to this idea of asking your painting questions, right? I think it's a fascinating thing. I haven't ever heard anyone talk about it the way I've seemed to be quite passionate about it, right? Which is this idea of just like have an open conversation with your work, right? Treat it as though it's alive. Treat it as though it's a real place. It's like, can you smell something that's there? What do you smell, right? And I feel like we all have these life experiences of visiting places and knowing things that allow us to step into something a bit more deeply. And I want to emphasize that those moments in our lives where we explore and learn are so powerful when it comes to art, because it imbues it with a sense of reality that you even subconsciously put into your work. And in that way, it starts to read as something just otherworldly, right? So yeah, art and life, it's kind of intrinsically linked, right? You can't really separate the two. So just building up my foreground here, adding a bit of paint texture to these rocks. In my own workflow, I do like to paint rocks, but if I can get away with using photos and then painting, I do that. But in this case here, I just want to show, like, rocks don't have to be complicated, right? Especially in the foreground where we tend to put a lot of detail, it's often a less is more type approach with rocks, right? If you use 1 or 2, 3 tones on a rock, maybe one for the base color, one for shadows, and one for a ambient light from above, sometimes that's enough, right? To really tell the form of a rock. And sometimes under rendering a rock, not going into too much detail, actually gives them a much more pleasing result. It makes it look much more rocky, right? The imperfections, as you can see, even me painting these mid-ground rocks here, I'm adding just a few brush strokes and it delivers so much texture, right? It's just literally a few dots here and there and a couple strokes and you have a complete rock. So rocks are very interesting in that they seem intimidating, but when you start just painting few tones on them, you'll notice the texture starts to come out. But it is, of course, those fundamentals, right? If you know your fundamentals, how light behaves, where it goes and what it does, it's just going to be tremendously easy or easier to accomplish these kind of rendering effects. So now I'm definitely moving into, laying out the majority of the painting. I'm moving into the background here. I'm trying to develop a sense of form overlapping form so that there's a sense of depth as the coast of this place rolls around to the tower. I want there to be a sense of one rock is in front of the other, is in front of the other, is in front of the other, until the very, very background. Now, initially, when I laid in this painting and I had the idea of a cave, I thought maybe there's an opening or a hole on top of this cave where light is exposing the tower and making this very interesting more exposed area in the center that we as viewers care about. And in that way, lighting is dramatic. You can use it to set up focal points and create areas of interest. But in this case here, I've painted so many dark, oppressive cave scenes in my career and in my time as an artist that I feel like sometimes I can't help but want to just make it more bright and interesting. And so later on, I actually open the cave up a bit and I allow light to pour in as a silhouette behind the tower. And that's purely because I felt, for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want too much oppression in an image. We want there to be a sense of airiness and life. And, I don't want this to be a depressing place. I want this to be an interesting place. And so those kind of intentions, when you're going into a painting, can change a huge portion of the painting. One would be like a dank, gross, moldy, troll-infested, toad-infested, like slimy kind of place. And another one would be like, this is a magical place. This is a place where things come to celebrate, drink water, hang out, have a good time. And that's what I really intend for this painting, right? That was my initial feeling. As you can see in the top left where it says feel, there was actually something else there. I replaced it with the word colorful, because even in Just Draw, Just Paint week 2, we did a pretty dark painting, something about an island raising out of the desert, filled with lava and people running into the action zone and, having that entire narrative going on. I feel like it's almost easier to paint dark, moody images than it is to make a happy, more interesting image. And of course that has to do with your personality as well as a person. I guess I struggle to paint happy things, not because I'm a dark person, but because it just naturally comes to me in a different way, right? And so I have to be aware of my weaknesses sometimes, and I have to work on them. And I think just even this painting is an excuse to do that, right? It's to just kind of go, hey, let's make a more optimistic, more interesting, bright, happy palette, happy lighting, and kind of push it towards that, right? And see what we can do. So I wish I had more time to work on this week and kind of deliver a little bit more of a polished result for you guys and kind of work up some of the more interesting elements that I couldn't put into the painting. But, you know, sometimes we just don't have the time, right? And you can see here, I'm starting to open up the back of that cave. Just make the whole image just a little bit more airy, right? A little bit more aesthetically joyful, right? And that is going to, I think, frame the tower as well. And also just highlight that entire focal area. Because if we go to black and white, you will see that the highest form of contrast is happening exactly where I want it to, right? And that's important. If you're creating an image, it's one of the ways we create focal points in the fundamentals is having this high contrast zone. And so typically it's quite nice when there's a burst through the wall to create a little bit of bloom lighting as well, where it kind of it glows a little bit and kind of fades out some of the edges. And we're going to work on that next when we start working up our lighting. But for the most part, the painting at this stage is basically done. So we're just adding details in here that are going to be reinforcing what already exists. And then we're going to be polishing everything that's there in an unrefined state. We're just going to clean up and we're going to re-emphasize. So by darkening the top of that tower and putting it more deeply into shadow, I'm bringing our focal point down back to that door and to that little lit pool area down below. And eventually I'm going to put some birds in there, right? And I wish, again, I had more time to develop and draw a ton of birds in here. I would have loved this whole place to just be one giant avian sanctuary, but it's a time thing. You know, I just couldn't pull it off this week with everything I had to do and show up for. I mean, it's a brand new week of the year, and so my mentees are back and I've had to give a lot of feedback. So it's been all over the place, right? Just opening up that left-hand side of the island. So this is supposed to be a quote-unquote drought in the brief, and it doesn't really feel like a drought inside the cave. Maybe if we went outside the cave, there would be a drought, and this could be the oasis. But it definitely doesn't feel dry. And so in that way, it's okay. I'm just going to ignore the brief, right? It's just a starting point, right? It gives me something to think about and a direction to take this. I don't like in the Just Draw series to kind of just overthink everything and kind of be super anal. You know, I'm trying to have fun, right? I'm trying to sit back and enjoy the rendering process. I love to jump around a painting like this and discover all my different areas that I like to paint into. I'm just going to adjust that tower. You can see I dropped in the photo by now. You know, just having a little bit more of a strong start with that tower allows it to be emphasized in a way that is much more beautiful, right? And so with that focal point, there has to be detail, right? So that's why there are all those details in that tower. It's like it's supposed to be the thing that we look at. It's lit. It has details. Our focal point goes there. The whole background, right? All those rocks, like very, very low detail, right? I really don't care about them. The entire idea is just, is there enough for overlap and visual interest? Yes, there is. Okay, well, that's good enough, right? We don't need to make it more complicated than that. We can just quite simply simplify. So opening up the rocks here a little bit on the left-hand side. Whenever there's an oppressive element like that, like the entire left-hand side just being occupied by one type of block, right? Then I try to open it up by creating gaps and things like that. It's a little bit of a hack for composition. So refining some of the light elements. One of the things I discovered actually after painting in quite a bit of sand here is that the sand didn't quite match up to my palette. So later on, I colorized that sand into a little bit more of a pink, and that actually makes it work quite nicely with the background. I think painting rocks and dirt can be super addictive. I was once on a project where I had to paint dirt for like 6 months. It was so crazy. So I got quite good at it, but you know, you start to learn certain tricks about it, you know, like what makes a stone look like it's buried, you know, or has sand next to it. Those are very useful things to learn when you're painting. Just separating that mid-ground element more into the mid-ground with some of that lighting, right? We don't want it to be as contrasty as the foreground. And this element on the left-hand side, it actually looks like a tree branch or something. So I'm going to separate some of these rock shapes here and make it look more like a stack of rocks and less like a tree stump. So we're in a cave after all, right? Even if it's a vertical bunch of rocks, we don't want it looking exactly like, you know, the perfect shape. So yeah, we're definitely in refinement phase now, right? We're trying things out, we're getting rid of elements, we're adding other elements, we're separating values, we're separating foreground, middle ground, background, we're adding details into the sky. We're just jumping around and making, quote unquote, the image better, right? So yeah, now we're in a stage where we can add a bit of bloom into the background, make it a bit more appealing. Tying the top of that tower to those colors as well, and adding a bit of vibrancy to the focal element, right? I want that area to just really look magical, right? And you can see I'm testing it in black and white. I often do that. There's a really awesome hack you can do in Photoshop to get a black and white representation of your painting with just a few keystrokes. I like to teach it to my students. It's pretty cool. I could explain it here, but it's a little bit long-winded. Needless to say, it's Control Y, and if you find the settings in your, I think it's the selection menu, you can change those settings to a 15% dot gain, and that creates a perfect black and white filter over your work with just 2 keystrokes, Control Y. And you can jump back and forth on that. And the beauty of it is that it maintains your color even in black and white. So you can actually paint in black and white and not destroy your color hierarchies. If that makes any sense to you guys. I really like how the water is turning out. I really like the right-hand side, you know, just adding a bit of bloom here. And I think we're at the stage of the painting where we're just going to start turning on layers of me working over this and not boring you to death with just how much I'm rendering everything out. I'm definitely checking out my my lighting here, making sure that it's going to work nicely. Okay, we're gonna jump in and take a look at the refinements that I'm doing here. So just cleaning everything up one by one. You know, little areas, little effects, separating elements. And I've adjusted that sand color that you can see in the background, much more homogeneous. I've added some details to the tower to make it a bit more visually poppy. And now I'm just going to add the final touches here, right? Which is just a few elements to reinforce the tower and some birds to give this place some life. And that's about it, guys. So that's the final painting. I hope you enjoyed watching the process this week. I look forward to making more of these for you in the future, and I'll see you next time.